Well, hello. I'd like to welcome you to this Global Think-In that's sponsored by the Committee on Global Thought. I'm Carol Gluck, and I'm the chair of the committee. For those of you who don't know, the Committee on Global Thought was founded by President Bollinger of Columbia in 2006 with the charge that the committee members lead people around the university, across disciplines and across schools to come up with new ideas and concepts and analyses that work better for our world in the 21st century than the concepts and ideas and analyses that we've been heir to for so long. It's a very hard, big charge. It's part of President Bollinger's view of global Columbia. And I will confess to you right at the start that the best thing about the Committee on Global Thought is that no one knows what global thought is, which means that we are free. We are untrammeled. We are without templates or paradigms or whatever. And that turns out to be a very, as Nadia says, liberating experience. I don't need to comment, I think, on the timeliness of this topic. It does seem essential to say sometimes in many of our gatherings that we think it is important to neither dismiss nor condescend to the surge of populism on either side of the political spectrum, left or right, but to try instead to understand the reasons for it, the goals, and the constellation of values that make populisms so attractive in our world today, not only in the United States, but in so many places around the globe. So that's important to say in the United States, I think, maybe more than other places, although it's similarly true in the UK, where one person described to me that you can get on the train at Glasgow and get off at London, and you would have passed every single part of the country that voted for Brexit and not know why they did. So there's a reason for this. Let me introduce briefly our speakers. The fuller biographies are in your program. We are very, very honored tonight. We have a very good panel of people who have been thinking about and writing about populisms now recently, a while ago, and to come. First, John Judis to my left, who is, I'm sure known to many of you, a celebrated author and journalist, currently, among other things, editor-at-large at Talking Points Memo and senior writer at the National Journal. He's the author of 7 books. I realize now I read the first one back in the 80s. So we go way back, although I've only just met you. And the most recent book, The Populist Explosion, How the Great Recession Transformed American and European Politics. It's published just this year by the Columbia Global Reports, which is a partner of the Committee on Global Thought in this evolving university called Global Columbia. It was reviewed recently in the New York Times, and the reviewers said that it was, quote, a cogent and exceptionally clarifying guide to a political phenomenon that is at once elusive and, yes, explosive. Our next panelist is Professor Nadia Urbinati, who is the Kyriakos Skakopoulos Professor of Political Theory and Hellenic Studies at Columbia. Among her books on modern and contemporary political theory in Europe and other places, especially relevant tonight, I think, is the book entitled Democracy Disfigured: Opinion, Truth, and the People. That's from 2014 from Harvard University Press. And in it, she speaks of 3 degradations or disfigurations of democracy: the unpolitical, the populist, and the plebiscitarian. So we'll hear more about that. Then we welcome next to Professor Urbinati, Federico Finchelstein, who is professor of history at the New School for Social Research, who will talk about populisms in Latin America. He's the author of 5 books and a frequent contributor to the press. And this coming spring, the University of California Press will publish his global study entitled From Fascism to Populism in History, which brings a valuable historical perspective to the subject at hand. After Latin America, we move to China with Xiaobo, who is professor of political science at Barnard College and the Weatherhead East Asian Institute at Columbia. He works on the political economy of post-socialist transition, political corruption, and contemporary Chinese politics and society. His current project addresses the rise of the regulatory regime in China. And we are fortunate to have Lawrence Liang as our discussant. He's based in Bangalore, a professor of law at Ambedkar University in Delhi. He is a lawyer with degrees in film studies and cultural studies, a writer, a human rights activist, and co-founder of Alternative Law Forum, which is a collective of lawyers in India working on public interest issues. He was a Fulbright Fellow at Columbia in 2010-11 and is currently a visiting fellow in South Asian Studies at Yale. So that is our panel. We will ask each of them to speak for 10 minutes to tell you all they know about populism. Sorry for the short time. We'll have some discussion among the panelists, and then the global think-in, by definition, is meant to be a dialogue. It's a conversation, so you are an integral part of it. So I hope you will participate and make the bulk of the time a real conversation so that we can think in together. So let me start then with John Judis and give you the microphone.
Thank you. You can hear me all right? You shouldn't feel bad about being at a committee on global thought. I was a graduate student for a year at a program called the History of Consciousness. And nobody knew what that was either, so it's all good, closer. All right. I'm supposed to talk about the United States, and I am going to limit myself to that. There's a certain irony, because when I began the book in May of 2015, I had to talk people into including the United States in the book, because at the time the Tea Party seemed to be dissipating. Occupy Wall Street was pretty much over, and there was nothing on the horizon. 2 or 3 months later, everything, of course, had changed. Let me begin. I'll sort of follow the pathway of what people have asked me when I've done these talks. And, I have a lot of other things to say, and you can ask me afterwards. But the first is the question of what is populism. Now, I don't have, and nobody here has, a definition that fits all uses of the term populist. What I'm talking about is a tradition that begins in the United States in the 1880s and 1890s, and that's where the term itself comes from, and it's the same term in German and French. Populism in the United States, we're thinking of the People's Party, Huey Long, George Wallace, up through Perot, Buchanan, and then Tea Party, Occupy, Sanders, and Trump, is characterized by a conflict between a group called the people and another group that's called the establishment or the elite. And there's no particular substantial definition of what the people or the elite are. They change with historical circumstances. From sometimes the people are the poor, sometimes they're the middle class, sometimes they're the silent majority. So that changes. The elite itself, sometimes they're the liberal Republicans, sometimes they're the treasonous Republicans, sometimes there's Wall Street. So what you have really is not so much an ideology in that sense, but a logic, a relationship between the people and the elite. Now, there are different kinds of populism. And in American history, and this is true now in Europe, particularly since in the wake of the Great Recession, there are left-wing and right-wing varieties. The left-wing varieties of populism are characterized by the attempt to unify the lower and the middle parts of the population against the top. It's a relationship that goes upwards. It's uniting the people against the billionaire class, against the ruling elite, or what have you. Right-wing populism is characterized by a third term. Now, if you look at people like Trump or George Wallace, I say, well, they're just right-wingers. But that's not quite true, because you find in them the same kind of conflict between the people and the elite over taxes, runaway shops, trade, what have you. But in addition, you find another element, which is a scapegoat, some group from illegal immigrants to African Americans to Muslims that the ruling elite is coddling. That's the element that you have with right-wing populism. And again, you have to be clear about that. Somebody can be critical of our immigration policies, that we let too many people in to the disadvantage of lower income people who are already here. But what distinguishes somebody like Trump, say, is not blaming that on the employers who, employ them and who seek these kinds of guest workers or whatever, but on the immigrants themselves, the Mexican rapists or what have you. So that's the right-wing variety. And again, People's Party, primarily left. Huey Long, again, primarily the left. George Wallace, right. Buchanan, right. Perot, more on the left. Sanders on the left, and Trump more on the right. Now, what is the function of populism in American politics? We have this two-party system which kind of squeezes out the extremes in elections. So it's very hard. Ooh, I got a 5-minute thing warning. I'll talk very fast now. So the two-party system, in effect, makes it very hard, in contrast to Europe, where you have a multi-party system, and you can have a populist party with 5% of the electorate that suddenly bursts forth and gets 20% and then becomes an enormous power. In the United States, it's much harder. So what we have are periodic bursts of populism. And what they do is they function primarily as early warning signs that a prevailing consensus is breaking down. People's Party, consensus around laissez-faire capitalism, unregulated finance, the role of banks. Huey Long, the neglect of economic equality as an issue in the 1930s. George Wallace, the segregation, the conflict within between whites and blacks over civil rights. Again, what you have with Perot, Buchanan, Sanders, and Trump is something else, and let me just briefly describe that. I think that what they're reacting to, and again, there's all kinds of other elements involved, nativism, racism, what have you, all these isms, is a change in American politics that begins in the 1970s as the boom of the post-war prosperity ends, and as corporations, businesses become much more nervous about their profitability, budgets start to get squeezed, and what you have is the development of a new kind of politics, supply-side economics. It's sometimes called, Europeans call it neoliberalism. I call it in the United States more market liberalism that stresses capital mobility. Corporations can move anywhere in the world they want. Regulations hinder them. Again, exchange, free exchange in terms of finance, labor mobility, again, a massive influx of immigrants into the United States after 1965 and then 1990, all of which have the effect of putting pressure on wages, increasing inequality, and in the case of finance, a deregulation of finance and this new kind of global order, precipitating a crash in 2008. And I think that if you look at what's happening, and particularly what I discovered after May 2015, a lot of what you hear from Trump, and certainly, of course, from Sanders, is a reaction to precisely that. And I'm not talking here about Trump on Trump's misogyny, his whatever. What I'm talking about is his attacks on NAFTA, his attacks on the China deal, his attacks on Ford Motor Company for moving its assembly plants to Mexico, on Carrier air conditioning, all these kind of things that one would have associated with the labor left. runaway shops as an evil element. That's an attack on the basic tenets of neoliberalism, as is his attack on immigration. Again, it veers way into nativism, but there is an issue there that's important. Let me conclude by saying a little about people always ask me, well, what's going to happen next? And I really don't know, because what you have here is an early warning signal. In 1965, when I was living in California, and this guy named Ronald Reagan was preparing to run for office against Pat Brown, nobody at that time could have predicted that 15 or 16 years later, this guy was going to be president, and the whole politics of the country would have changed so dramatically from what it was in 1965 and 1966. We're in a kind of similar situation now, I think, where 10 or 15 years from now, it's going to be very hard. It's going to be very different, the politics from the way it is now. And I'll just point you, in conclusion, to the two things. Both Sanders and Trump are pointing a dagger at the heart of the respective coalitions. Sanders, again, at the alliance of the Democrats with Wall Street. Its finances have been almost entirely dependent upon Wall Street for the last 10 or 20 years as the labor movement has lost steam. Trump, again, business, the Koch brothers, Chamber of Commerce on the one hand, and the white working class on the other, which the Republicans were able to bring along as part of this unwieldy coalition. Suddenly, it's at stake. And suddenly, he seems to be driving a wedge in it. So what's going to happen is not clear, but both these parties, these major coalitions, are now in doubt and are in danger because of these populist upsurges on the left and the right.
Thank you. Nadia?
Okay, so let me say briefly something about the context in Europe. The broader context of democracy's precariousness that we find there. And I singled out 5 of these precariousness expression of democracy within which populism is located. So I will be very, very schematic and telegraphic. First, the intrusion of the domain of economy in the domain of the polity, visible in the failure of democracies to constrain financial capitalism, the tendency to allow businesses to financially opt out of democratic decisions. The great debate on great, or I don't know how much great, but the important debate on TTIP. The second context, a renewed strengthening of the political power of organized religion as part of the polity, which is a major source of opposition to gender and sexual equality in Europe. And I'm thinking about traditional denominations like the Vatican or Orthodox churches is much more important for the European context than the Muslim in this case. Third, a rise of authoritarianism that is visible in the strengthening of the radical right. And fourth, the increasing, or the calls for, restrictions on citizenship based on racialized features, religion or ethnicity, across European countries. And fifth, here I am, the rise in illiberalism and populism, including criticism on independent thinking and on collective actions. There are increasing calls for political restrictions of academic autonomy and freedom of the press and opinion. We know about Turkey, but also in Hungary and also in Poland, for instance. It is a situation that is expanding. So let me say that within these 5 issues within which I like to situate populism, let me say that I have many reservations on today's fashionable talks on good and bad populism and left and right populism. We can discuss in the conversation. At the bottom of the good one, there is in fact a nasty exclusionary passion in constructing the we, the honest and ordinary people, against the others. Now, who are the others, and what we, the honest and the good, want to do with them? Well, this is an issue that is open. When this issue is let to be an issue for the large majority, this becomes a problem. So good and bad are issues that to be discussed. Creating the populist people, constructing the people, this is the object of populism, is the source of the problem we have to ponder, because this is what populism is about. Now, take the case of the Night of Labor in the late 19th century America, just mentioned. One of the backbone movements of the People's Party, traditionally known as the image of good populism. Now, the romance of good and honest workers did not help these good populists to be truly good with everybody. So Hungarians, Italians, Irish, black former slaves, they were not as honest, as good as the self-represented Earl of the founding nationals. So they were black sheep, I quote from Michael Casin. And you find the same kind of tropes in Europe today. So where is good populism here? But this good versus bad logic permeates populism whenever populism emerges. Thus, I propose we evaluate and judge populism in relation to not good and bad, but in relation to, one, what it proposes and says, that is opinion, populism as opinion, populism as a movement. And second, what populism does and decides, that is populism in power. So it is thus inaccurate to treat populism in power as identical with populist movements or popular movements or the popular. Because of course there are popular movements that they use the populist rhetoric, but they don't want even to have representatives in parliaments. Think about Occupy Wall Street. They used the populist trope, we and them, but they didn't want even to participate in the elections, even to participate in the representative constituency game. Or think about all political parties where they are very close to elections. They become radical sometimes in their rhetoric. You cannot say that they are populist. So the discourse of populism or populism as a movement is one thing. Let's instead consider when these populist becomes an organized narrative and his aspiration is to win seats in parliaments or the Congress. And he wants a leadership that claims to represent the through people or the people as a whole. And in this case, we have to judge what populism in power is about and what it does. Now, think about Europe in this case. There is a populist rhetoric and a populist power when a movement does not want to be a constituency independent of the elected officials, but wants instead to conquer the representative institutions and win a majority in order to model society on its own ideology of the people. This is, for instance, the case of Hungary's Fidesz party that in 2012 won a supermajority in the seats in parliaments and used this supermajority to scrap the old constitution by amending it continuously, entrenching its own political vision at the expense of opposition parties and the independent judiciary. Similar events may happen in Poland after the electoral victory of Kaczynski's PiS party after 2014. So, of course, populism is a contested category, as many political terms are. But some general trends can be detected from the historical evolution of these 250 or so years of history of democracy in after the 18th century on. So there are plural, different kinds of populism, but some common trends can be seen. First of all, it is certainly true that populism develops within representative democracy. It is not a form of direct democracy, although populist leaders and parties, they like to use referenda and plebiscites to fuel people's rage against something or somebody, or in order to gather support on their own, for themselves. So populism is a fight over the meaning and representation of the people, an extreme expression of majority or intense majoritarianism, and thus a straining of constitutional democracy at its extreme limits, behind which you may have perhaps a new regime. Inside of these limits of constitutionalism, although stretched to majoritarianism, you are still within democracy, after all. Now, this is the kind of populism I'm interested in, and Europe is an interesting case, because populism is back in many European countries within, and this is the novelty, within a supranational, quasi-federative context, and several decades of cosmopolitan culture of rights and toleration that lessened nationalist politics. The European Union, which developed as an anti-totalitarian project after World War II, is a novel frontier of populism, which is emerging no longer and simplistically as a claim for going back to pre-European Union order. Brexit will not be a temptation for many others countries in Europe, in my mind, but instead is a design for a new representation of the European people as an ancestral totality against external sources of contaminations, two in particular, the affluent cosmopolitan elites and immigrants, the two enemies of populism for Europeans and in Europe. Thus, a globalized financial capitalism that weakens the decision-making power of sovereign states, and a globalized market of labor force that narrows the possibility of striking a social democratic compromise upon which democracy was built after World War II, these are the important factors to be considered in order to explain the renaissance of populism in Europe and the possibility for an European continental populism. So the weakening of state sovereignty before global corporate business meets with the people's call for closed borders, not of commodities, but of labor. In many nation states, as if democratic citizens thought that the protection of their political power demands the containment of free movement of people and of free competition over salary and social benefits. So like in the past, populism associates politics of social redistribution with forms of protectionist politics. In this case, labor, not all kinds of protectionism or protectionism. In addition, the dramatic phenomenon of terrorism propels a politics of state security at the expense of civil rights and highlights the nationalistic character of democracy. Democracy was built upon nations in Europe as a vital condition of cultural and religion or religious homogeneity. Just to mention, before rushing to the conclusion that populist party promotes a secession from Europe, think about that. A new phenomenon is emerging, as I mentioned at the beginning, and I would like to conclude with that of an European nationalism, propelled precisely by countries ruled by populist majorities. Take the case of Hungary, the last referendum of October the 4th. Orban declared Hungary to be the guardian of the gates of Europe, the protection of the core values of Christian Europe. So he's claiming a representation of Europe, not of his own people simply, when he claims to be a populist leader. Thus, more than an explosion of Brexit, we may witnessing instead the growth of continental nationalism or European populism. After all, if theorists and political scientists are true that populism is a fight over the representation and the construction of the people, the European people is something to be constructed today, and thus the natural terrain for populism. Now, this is, according to me, the most important challenging moment in Europe. Seems to be counterintuitive because we identify populism with nationalism and nationalism with the nation. But in Europe, the challenge is perhaps something more than that, precisely because the construction has their own terrain for initiatives. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. Yes, thank you. Okay, Federico.
Thank you. I'm very happy to talk about populism as a global issue because that is certainly my position. I mean, as an historian, I have a problem that I share with historians at large, I think, that we have a marketing problem because we have in the field a lot of explanations which aim at this kind of simplicity, or at least a desire of, to explain populism in simple terms. And here we come basically with the argument that things are complex, and we are, and basically when we start studying the history of populism, what you see actually is that first there is a problem with explanations that emphasize this kind of a prioristic take on definitions. And second, that is even harder to understand what populism is because it has been many, many things. So in many theories, that is a problem that is very easy to solve. You just exclude certain cases. So many colleagues of mine will say, for example, Trump is not a populist. A famous theorist of populism, Casmude, for example, says Trump is not a populist. And he has been saying this, and the more you read his objections, the more you understand that basically the problem is that Trump defies his own definition of populism is. For historians, this is not really a challenge in a way, but a delight, because it makes things complex as we would like to explain them. But in any case, that somehow defines this element that our books are not good in terms of marketing. And it's very hard for us to reach a wider public, because we are all the time saying, it's more complex than that. It has been left and right. It has promoted inclusion and exclusion. But then what comes after this, I think, and I will, as I promised, I will very, very soon speak about Latin America. But what comes after this is that the more you engage in a kind of, as I have been doing, in a kind of a global study of populism in history, what emerges out of it is that there are certain patterns, clearly. And certain patterns, which with Nadia just mentioned, are there all the time. The most important of them, I think, which Nadia mentioned, is that populism is a disfigurement of democracy. It's an authoritarian understanding of democracy that strains democracy, as Nadia just said, without destroying it. And that without destroying it is central, because although, I think, me, probably you, and many in the public, especially in the United States, when they hear someone like Trump, they hear echoes of fascism. And that is right, because populism belongs to a broader history that also has fascism as a chapter. And that history is a kind of modern resistance to democracy that doesn't, that presents democracy as a challenge to be solved without going back to, let's say, the monarchic solutions of the past. Now, the difference between fascism and populism, as I said, they are related. The big difference is that fascism uses democratic means to destroy democracy from within and establish a dictatorship. And in history, generally, populism doesn't do that. Doesn't do that because basically populism uses democratic terms to strain democracy, not to destroy it. And what comes out of that is this authoritarian version of democracy, which makes people, to put it in colloquial terms, very, how can I say, to feel that this is very weird or even crazy. But it's not. And the more you study its history, you understand the particular context in which populism emerges. And I share with Nadia the idea that in order to be seriously study populism, you not only need to study populism as a movement, but also as a regime. And it happens to be the case that it first emerges as a regime in Latin America. Practically, it does so in my own country, Argentina. So this is almost like a bad joke about Argentines, because here I am, the Argentine guy that tells you that it's very important to understand Argentina to understand the world. And I will try to explain why this is the case, very nationalist. And almost, I know I don't have time, but I love this joke, so I will tell it. That this is a question about what an Argentine does when he or she is in Paris. Well, he or she goes to the top of the Eiffel Tower. Why? because he or she would like to see Paris, how Paris looks without him or her. So basically, in this tradition of being, this nationalist tradition of ascribing centrality to Argentina as a country, this is the context, actually, the national context in which populism first emerged in Argentina with Juan Perón as its leader. Now, this is very important because why Argentina? Argentina, as you know, was a country that was full of Nazis, as I have studied in some of my books, full of fascists, and yet fascism wasn't defeated in Argentina. So Argentina lives the kind of post-war moment that, in my view, defines what modern populism is. Because all that 19th century stuff, in my opinion, and even fascism in the interwar years, these are very different contexts in which democracies and even liberalism is not as legitimate as it will be after 1945. For example, in the 1920s and 30s, and also in Latin America, you have like three isms, basically: fascism, communism, and liberalism. Now, one of them is gone after 45. And yet a country like Argentina has not been defeated, so that thing that is gone, globally it's impossible to be a legitimate leader after 1945 as being a fascist or a fascist dictator. And yet, basically, there is an attempt in Argentina to recuperate some of the baggage of fascism, or the legacy of fascism. Let me put it this way: to recuperate the legacy of fascism without its baggage. And the baggage is radical violence, genocide, although it was not presented exactly in this way at the time, but this is exactly what Perón says, and dictatorship. So here you have an actual dictator that decides to, as opposed to basically fascism, he decides to destroy a dictatorship from within and call for elections and become the elected president of Argentina. Other examples soon follow. Another dictator, Vargas in Brazil, returns to power as the elected president of the country. And you have similar situations in Bolivia and Venezuela. I'm talking about the 1940s now. So you have people that come from the world of dictatorship and decide to basically legitimize themselves as democratic leaders. But because there are a lot of connections between that past, basically what you have is a reformulation of fascism for the post-war years. And this is very important because when you see this analogy, then you start to understand better why somebody that probably knows nothing about fascism sounds that much as a fascist. And I'm talking about Donald Trump. And yet he's not. He is also another child of this project against a liberal version of democracy. Because if something, again, I'm totally against definitions, but if something basically is at the center of populism, is that it's against liberalism. Populism is always against liberalism, but now within the world of democratic representation. And the baggage that comes with that is that basically you have a dual notion of sovereignty. Because you have a sovereignty that comes from the fact that these leaders have been elected, and you have something else. You have that these leaders, even without the elections, are godlike figures which speak for the people even before they vote. So they are the voice of the people. They represent the people, they embody the people, they are even better than the people and certainly know what the people want even when they don't know it. And yet they also need, that will be like the most authoritarian, fascist-like moment of sovereignty in populism. But also that is connected to another one, which is democratic legitimation. And the outcome of that is an authoritarian form of democracy, which first appeared in Latin America. The last thing that I will say, I haven't seen the sign though. So, okay, no, please. Oh, wow. So I missed the 5 minutes. Okay, so I would like just to to leave this for Q&A if some of you are interested in this. That one of the interesting things about Latin American populism, and especially Peronism in Argentina, is that we always hear that populism can be right or left, and that's quite right. There are many synergies between Mr. Trump, for example, and the European right, and many criticisms of someone like the Kirchners in Argentina. They don't identify. They are not part, as the fascists were, of a common international. And yet, in the case of Peronism, we have seen in history, from the 1940s to the present, all possibilities so far. So Peronism has been an authoritarian corporate form of, authoritarian democracy. Then in the 1960s, some Peronists became neo-fascists, straining, as Nadia was suggesting, democracy so far that they were almost going back to fascism, to what fascism was, almost calling for dictatorship. You have also leftist revolutionary versions also at the point of going against democracy. And finally, you have in the 1990s neoliberal Peronism with the presidency of Carlos Menem, and more recently a leftist version with the Kirchners. So the question is, what all these situations have in common? And I will say that perhaps, stressing this idea of democracy, a democracy that is against liberalism is at the center of this. Then the context of the politics, they might be very different, but this is at the kernel of the thing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. The previous three speakers discussed mostly populism, the rise of populism in democracies. I want to talk about populism without democracy. I thought this is an interesting topic that probably I should write my article or book on this exact topic, because my previous book is on taxation without representation in China. Now we can talk about populism without democracy in China. I think may come as somewhat a shocking surprise to a lot of people in the audience that China really has not got one single immigrant from Syria or refugee from Syria. And China has benefited greatly from globalization and has seen economic growth. And yet China actually has a very, a rising sentiment of xenophobia and anti-immigration. I'll talk about this in more detail. And what's really interesting is this attitude toward Trump. There was an international survey by Gallup International. It surveyed 45 countries. It's not quite well publicized, but it's actually, it did early this month. It surveyed 45 countries, including Portuguese, some European countries, and China and Russia. And you probably could guess that they asked literally people, what do they think of the two major candidates? And the very bottom, of course, is Russia. In Russia, predominantly people supported Trump. So China is next. China, even though the majority is still Hillary, but the gap is only 9%, much smaller than other countries. Russia is minus 23% when it comes to Hillary. So that's interesting. And if you look at, my research interest on China's populism is because I actually started several years ago on sort of observing and studying China's social media. So if you look at China's social media today, China, by the way, has a very vibrant social media scene, then Trump got a lot of support. And that makes people think this is why this is happening. So I want to talk three things today, right, very briefly. One is about what are the indicators and features of Chinese populism, and what are the factors that causes this kind of rise in a non-democracy? And finally, why should we worry about it? So what? As political scientists, we always ask, so what? So let me highlight a few features. So you have Trump-type leaders, Putin, Duterte, Trump now, receive this very high marks among Chinese social media users. And they're quite outspoken about it, actually, about issues related to the West, and especially the United States. And that's in a country where domestic political issues are kind of the red line nobody seems to want to cross. Yet you see in the social media, international affairs like this are widely discussed, and government is okay with it. So you see that kind of sort of discussing international affairs, not avoiding kind of domestic political sensitive issues. And also they're quite vocal on China's social economic issues. Make no mistake, on social media. So they're deeply suspicious of authorities, including government, anti-experts, anti-immigrant, again, this is quite interesting, and or at least wary about Muslims. China does have Muslim problems, sort of, even though it is certainly not to any stretch of imagination to the stretch of, of many European or other countries, but still, that is the anti sort of Muslim feeling is on the rise, as I observed. And finally, there is so-called anti-political correctness. That's a surprise. Because I was chatting with someone and said, you have a non-democracy, you really don't, China never had a left populists. You have this sort of what are the political correctness in China? This would include animal rights, women's rights, and a sort of a affirmative action like a preferential policy, as it's termed by those who are against it, provincial policy toward ethnic minorities, including Muslims, special Muslims. They think this government has done too much to woo the Muslims and other minorities. So they think this is, so there is a sort of so-called political correctness against it. And also, they tend to be younger, unlike in the United States and Europe. They tend not to be sort of the economically downtrodden, so to speak. Many of them actually quite well-educated, college education. Again, this is somewhat different from the so-called Trump supporters, many of Trump supporters in this country. Right, so you notice that there's some of them, and interestingly, if you notice, in the last few years, there's a few social debates that makes this kind of rights populism sentiments much more stark. One is about Chinese traditional medicine, right? So there is a debate involving scientists from both sides who are more supportive of the Western so-called, so more critical of Chinese traditional medicine, and others support it, and that involves a lot of, sort of general public in there. The other one's on GMO. Genetically moderated organism. The GMO has a huge debate, also involves both intellectual elites and general population. I think those are two examples of this kind of debate kind of nurtured and roused this sentiments against intellectuals, against experts, scientists. So this anti-experts and anti-sort of the mainstream, suspicious of anything that's sort of the relate to authority that's been kind of nurtured. And also, I would mention that this, in China, is closely related to the nationalistic emotions. This is why I said this is very much of a, from very onside, this rise of populism is very much on the right side of things, if we use that right and left. So it has, in fact, among the jargons of the newly coined by the Chinese populists, I would say, include white lefties. And in their eye, this is very much of in the debate lately, that in their eye, Europe and the United States, especially Europe, is being damaged by this bunch of lefties, white lefties. They use white lefties, so which I think has undertone of ethno-nationalist emotions. And white lefties has been already damaging the Europe, and now it's going to damage the United States. That's how they view the world. And indeed, that's also what draw them to Trump, who is sort of very much against immigrants and Muslims. So that part of that. And of course, there are others. Let me just turn to the factors. What I think why this rise. Of course, China is a part of globalization. It's also part of the backlash, ironically, right? Because China's indeed, has seen a great progress in economic growth. Right? Its people's livelihood was very much improved in the last 30 plus years. So in general, China has benefited from globalization. Yet, as other countries, China also have haves and have-nots, or who have benefited more and who have benefited less. In fact, if you look at the wealth structure today in China, it's very much, it's a huge gap. Very much like the United States, even worse in a sense, because the United States, according to one index, last year, the Gini coefficient, United States is 0.40, where China is 0.46. It's already get better from the peak of 0.49, but still, it's quite bad. So you have this gap. Even though China has lifted many people out of poverty into so-called middle class or middle income, still those in the middle class field, they're still kind of have not benefit as much. Right? So that's related to another issue of kind of people, the idea of success is driving people. Right? You have this kind of a social Darwinianism having the say of the day in China. And so that's why a lot of people are kind of surprised by many new Chinese American immigrants, first generation. I have to say, like me, who has studied in the United States, and they're actually a lot of Trump supporters. Surprise, surprise. Well, a lot of it is that kind of respect the strong, right? The kind of, striving for success, very Republican. They think that Trump somehow represent that, right? So they really had that there's others, but that obviously is very much part of the calculation. So that brings me really another major, I think, factor that can nurture this. That is the diminishing efficacy of official ideology. The official ideology has completely kind of really people, no one believe in it anymore, right? People 30 years ago struck, Chinese Communist Party and Deng Xiaoping struck a social pact. That is, I will make you rich, and you basically support me. That social pact, Communist Party delivered that. But after 30 years, facing this changing socioeconomic situation, Chinese Communist Party has not got any better ideas, if you will. So ideas really is lacking. Ironically, let me just, I know that my time is up almost, but 3 years ago, the Communist Party realized they have a problem on their hands. They do realize that using performance legitimacy is no longer going to work, especially when the economy is going to be in the new normal, that is a low, mid-range growth. So they actually produce a new document on the so-called socialist core values. They did 3 years ago. But if I ask those Chinese who are, students or in the audience, what is the Chinese socialist 3 years ago at the party congress? What is the official? Nobody could actually tell me. I asked my students. It's actually 24 characters, 12 words. I really want to use my time to say this because this is really interesting. This is 12 words. Prosperity, democracy, civilness, harmony, freedom, equality, justice, rule of law, patriotism, professionalism, integrity, and kindness. That's almost all the great progressive ideas are there, right? Except nobody believes in it. And in fact, I asked my Chinese students, I said, do you see this? Did you have education or lessons on it? They said, not really, but I saw them in the subway. I mean, probably the subway advertisement had that. But that's how pathetic the official ideology is today. And what's left is a void. What's left is a void of that social Darwinism is on the rise, right? So that the government is really somehow, and what's also interesting, as I noticed in this 24 words, the concept, one word is lacking: tolerance. Tolerance is lacking. It's a very important democratic idea. It's not there. So that really what's actually nurturing is a kind of, black and white picture of the world. So that I think this is what drives this rise of communism. And then finally, social media. I mean, I could, I know my time is up. Social media is a space, especially for non-democracy like China. Because mainstream media, you can't express your opinion. So what do? You spread out, social media also part of globalization. There's no bound. Information comes no bound. Except, of course, you can always selectively transform and accept information. And a lot of Chinese, this is not a stretch. They actually get from some right-wing, alt-right-wing website, making it as if this is news. They actually from Breitbart, that kind of information. So you see this is spreading and it's expanding. It's worrisome. Let me end by saying that as populism rise in the world globally, as a political scientist, I'm also concerned about something else. If you think that democracy, like in this country or democracy, populism is bring down the discourse, right? You bring down from a certain height. In China, there is no democracy yet. Where do you bring it to? It's already in the gutter, so to speak, right? I mean, people already start anti-political correctness. I always argue, where is political correctness? Where is women's rights? So a lot of it has to do with the government, squeezing the space of what true liberal ideas in China. Anyway, so let me end here.
To be a responsible respondent would require me to dedicate 2.5 minutes per speaker, which as a human rights lawyer, I believe would be a grave injustice to their work. So I'm going to sidestep that role, official role, and I'm going to join the global party on populism by bringing in the story of India. And I hope to be able to weave in some threads between all the 4 speakers. And this is in a way a variation of what Federico said, which is to say that to understand the 4 speakers before me, you have to understand India. And the reason that you have to do that is, given that it's the largest democracy in the world, and in the 2014 elections, arguably one of the most widely participated election in the history of democracy, we had the emergence of course, Narendra Modi with absolute majority. And I want to figure this in terms of the larger, conversation that we're talking about populism in terms of the contemporary. There is, of course, a much longer and older history, and I think there are many resonances that are here. For example, the debate between good versus bad populism, the debate between left versus right populism, because in some ways, the first wave of populism in India was really in the 70s when Indira Gandhi had assumed power and spoke on behalf of the people, pitching it against democratic institutions, including the judiciary, that she saw would, kind of feudal or were anti, kind of progressive reforms that she had in mind, which of course resulted in the first internal emergency in the country with the suspension of democracy for three years. So what's the difference then, and how do we actually, mark the shift from the 70s to the contemporary and the rise of Hindu right-wing, kind of populism? I think there are a number of things that the 2014 election alerts us to, but I'm going to pick up from something that Professor Liu ended with, which is the crucial question of media. There is consensus that the 2014 elections was in some ways an element of the victory of Narendra Modi is attributed to a mediated populism. But while traditional studies of media and populism, including Mazzolini's work, has focused on the question of broadcast and print media, I'm really interested in the question of social media, especially from kind of, in a way, a political ontology of understanding what it did and what it does, and what is the kind of affective viral charge that social media provides to our understanding of populism itself. I think that the 2014 elections is different from any other elections because of the new media ecology under which it took place. So in addition, of course, to 800 television channels, of which you have 300 24/7 news channels, this is also a period where we see India crossing 1 billion mobile phones, including 250 mobile smartphones capable of sending, relaying, and transmitting text, image, and video. Modi and Trump are very similar in that they were extremely active on social media, and Modi is reportedly has the second largest number of followers on Twitter after Obama. Modi has mastered the art of using the internet as a form of direct address, connecting with the people, and amongst his various social media tactics, he includes following ordinary people every once in a while, and every time he does it, it makes news. Now, what happened immediately after the 2014 election was after he had cast his vote, he came out and took a selfie of himself with his inked finger against the backdrop of the lotus, the political symbol of the BJP. And he tweeted this. His media team immediately went into action and urged people to send images of themselves, selfies of themselves, and they created a gigantic mosaic image of Narendra Modi composed of little individuals with their selfies. The mosaic, if you have a look at it, has a striking resemblance to the famous cover of Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, and I'll return to the significance of this as well as the difference. So while many people have commented on the relationship between populism and media, I think the crucial innovation in the case of the 2014 election was really that of the micro image. And the question for me is in terms of the understanding the viral affective charge that is so integral to the construction of, in a way, a new form of populism. His media management team has always distinguished him from what they describe to be the lifeless, lacking in youthful energy of the previous Prime Minister, Manmohan Singh. And in contrast, there was an extremely masculine kind of projection of Modi as a man of action. Now, not very different from Trump's invocations of stamina constantly in his kind of media addresses. So this kind of the rhetoric of bringing together in a way the language of vitality and the entire language of virility, very interesting linguistic coincidence that one cannot discuss the two of them without discussing in a way the virality of populism. If scholars have focused in the past on traditional media, the question that I have is, how do we theorize the place of affective intensities in modern mass-mediated democracies where people are simultaneously asked to belong to concrete crowds even as they belong to abstract publics? And what happens to political authority when it no longer resides in the physical body of the singular sovereign, but is articulated via the space of mass publicity? Is this new form of populism the product of an emerging kind of techno-political assemblage where we see a politics of immediation? And I use this term both in terms of its temporal dimension of an immediate access to something called the people, as well as the bypassing of the traditional barriers associated with political communication. If we return to the Modi mosaic, and the striking resemblance that I said that, and Paulo Vierno, for example, argues that in Spinoza, the multitude indicates a plurality which persists as such in the public scene, in collective action, and in the handling of communal affairs without converging into one. Now, to my mind, one of the great challenges of thinking about social media and populism is that this difference between the multitude and the people may be a little more complicated and could be a little blurred. If you were to look, for example, at the specific political technologies at play here, in the mobilizing, in a way, of a new kind of crowd, what we have with social media and with mobile phones is a crowd in a way that is conscious, thoroughly conscious of itself as a movement headed towards a common goal, which in a way we might suggest the crowd is no longer, in a way, an effect of technological devices, but a kind of technology itself. And the crucial kind of link between the two has to be actually understood. So in contrast to the relative passivity of the people in, let's say, the Hobbesian image, the anonymous individual who makes up the Modi mosaic is an active political agent, even if sustained through the illusion of interactivity. And it seems to me to complicate the difference between the passivity of the people compared to the active vitality of the multitude. And I think that there's something to be unpacked there. And this, to my mind, is best illustrated by the rise of a new kind of figure. And this is a figure, in a way, of the vigilante acting in the name of the sovereign, using social media in a way both as a form of authority as well as a kind of a source of inciting forms of new kinds of violence. And I want to think about this idea of a populist vigilantism as a dangerous trend that we see emerging, especially in the Indian context, where populist violence in this account seems to enjoy a tacit sanction. It acts vicariously on behalf of the sovereign, even, and if, as a lawyer, you know, the idea of the vicarious in law denotes a liability. But in populism, it seems to be a reference to an impunity for any vigilante action, since it expresses the will of the people that's tacitly approved by the sovereign. And how do I illustrate this? If you look, for example, at the number of social media kind of, relations that someone like Narendra Modi has, there have been a number of figures who have emerged in India in the last couple of years. There are people like Dinanath Batra, Tejinder Singh Bagga. These are names that may not be familiar, but think of them in a way as the agent provocateurs who actually have no official relationship to the sovereign, but yet enjoy a kind of sovereignty as a result of their popularity in the domain of social media. Now, what happens here, there seems to be, in a way, a kind of a tacit approval of every action that's carried out in their name, which in a way reminds us that the relationship or any claim to sovereign power has always been simultaneously an idea of a sensuous incitement, even as you retain a symbolic order. And the relationship between the two, for me, is very severely recalibrated by social media. Let me end with just one thought, and the thought is this. If one were to think, for example, of the antecedents of the right-wing kind of populism in the Indian context, one could locate it in the figure of Bal Thackeray, the former leader of the Shiv Sena in Maharashtra. What is very interesting is Bal Thackeray was never the chief minister. He was always, in a way, a kind of a shadow sovereign figure who liked to call himself many things. He called himself the Supremo, etc. But one of the nicknames that was given to him was the remote control. The remote control is an interesting metaphor because if one looks at the history of the metaphor, it's not so much a technological term associated with video and television as much as a political term. The term originated in 18th century England during the trial of Thomas Hardy, where during the trial John Milford coined the phrase to describe the control of the people or institutions exercised at a distance. And this was a contrast to the direct democracy that Hardy propagated. So the analogy for me is an interesting one to think about this intermingling between authority, technology, and politics. And it's in the transaction between these two forms of authority, that of political power and that of political technologies, that I suggest that we need to analyze the new face of populism that we see globally. So I'll stop with that. It's not really a response, but I do hope that there are some connections.
Thank you. Let me put some things together and see whether they work. It seems to me that we have a for the first point, you have several suggestions as to what the causes of populism are. And I hear some commonalities in the strain of the consensus, the ideology that doesn't work, that doesn't work for people. The interesting thing here is it doesn't matter whether it's democracy or not. There's this missing, something has gone absent, I think, is what I'm hearing. That's one thing, which is I think a political and a social and ideological question. The second one is the one we hear more often, which is the economic. Who's falling out of the middle class, as I say, in the United States? Who's not getting into it in China? Related to that is the usual bugaboo about globalization, which is to say that the reason the people are strained economically is because of globalization, which links to the anti-other part of things, the anti-immigrant, the anti-somebody who's taking it away or whatever. But even in countries where there's no immigration, and China's not the only one, you have the same sort of torque, of twist on things, which says that there's something about our own self-identity that's not working, so we need to posit or condemn the other as a way of identifying ourselves. That seems to work for Professor Urbinati's idea of European populism. I mean, that's Europe against another other. So, all right, we're not Belgian. Well, they are. They are also Danish populists and everything. But the idea that there be a European populism suggests that's against the other. So you have this lack of political consensus or political logic failing, if you like. You have the economic causes tied to globalization, and you have this identity question which posits the other, even if there's no others there to shake hands with. A second question has to do with the question of populism in your language, John, it was Nadia, I think, who said populism as opinion and populism in power. Now, this relates to the whole democracy question, because populism as opinion, as you say, politicians can sound that way right before the election, doesn't mean much, or there's lots of populist appeal. But what happens when populists actually get elected? And that's what Federico says, that you could transmogrify fascism after the Second World War in Latin America by being elected. Right? And no, it's no longer fascism, it's democracy, but the characteristics, there are some linked or shared characteristics. So when we analyze them, I think this question of populism in opinion and populism in power is very important to separate, because now, of course, in Europe, in many countries, the populist opinion is now becoming populist powers. I mean, it could happen in Austria anytime soon, and it has. Some people say that Le Pen could be could come to the presidency of France, but it relates to the question of democracy, I think. And under this question of populism as opinion, populism as power, is the whole question of democracy and who are the people. And clearly, who are the people in most of these are the importance of an undifferentiated lump, which is why this idea of a mosaic of all these supporters of Modi taking selfies and making them into the idea that they are individuals, when in fact the idea that they're the multitude, when in fact they're represented as the people. So how can democracy exist? You've heard several people say that populism strains democracy, it stretches it, it challenges it. What's the relation between the democracy and the people who elect, or the multitude, or the people in China who don't elect but have resort to other media to express themselves? So that's a second group of ideas. A third group of ideas has to do with what's new in this. Now, globalization has been the favorite whipping boy for new, for the last 25 years. How we can call it new anymore is hard to understand. But globalization is one of the things. Another one is, and you hear this language all the time, the unprecedented movement of people. We've always had movement. We've never had this many people, refugees and displaced people. Another has to do with the fact that and you hear this on both sides, either the nation state is stronger than it ever has been and everybody's nationalistic, or the decline of the nation state because of transnational corporations and globalization and all the rest of it. But clearly there's something new, people think, about the way the nation relates to the world and the world relates to the nation. The question, another new, and this is brought to us by Lawrence Liang, another new thing that you hear all the time is the role of social media in politics. And you hear it all the time, whether it's the Arab Spring or it's the Iranian protests or it's the Chinese, the extremely dynamic social media world in places like China, South Korea, other places. So where do you place this? A lot of people are giving a great deal of effectiveness to the question that we are now working with social media, not with mass media or older media. So those are some of the newnesses. It's unclear to me as a historian how new any of these things really are. But still, that's the question about, do the multitude, does the crowd, do the people, do they relate to one another and therefore to this abstract thing that you're talking about called the state differently than before? And through this, you also heard the language of direct versus representative democracy, direct versus symbolic, other kinds of ways that are direct democracy, which is indirect democracy is representative democracy. Direct democracy is what some of the populist language seems to imply. Whether there can be direct democracy that isn't a dictatorship, I don't know. So those are three things that I hear, and I'd like to talk about them. I'd like to I don't think we can solve them particularly, but I think you've heard the three constellations of ideas, one political, one economic, and one social, pretty much cover the ground. And I think the last question I hope that the panel and you all will address is not so much why now, but what's the impact of this? And what is I mean, not to see the future, but what's the impact of this? And how do we deal with it in our respective countries or across borders? Maybe that's too big to think about, but somehow I think we need to figure out not just what populism is, but what populism does, and then what it is that we are and what it is that we do. So I'd like to ask the panel if you have any responses to my slightly sloppy summary, and then we'll open it to the floor. So in reaction to any of the things that each of you have said, or reactions to what I summarized, please. No, doesn't matter. Anybody? May I? Yes, please.
So yeah, of course, we would need much more time to go through all these categories that you were capable of bringing out of our conversation. So, few things, at least as far as I was able to understand in this reading. Yeah, I'm sorry. Election is very important in my view, because sometimes you read that populism has to do with direct democracy. This is truly a very imprecise, to say the least. First of all, because the leader or this Caesar kind of leader wants to have the recognition by the people to be formal, not simply to be in the opinion. They want people elected, they want people to be elected and to prove that they have formally the support of the people. Elections in the form of plebiscite is crucial for populism. Populism is a Latin word, comes from the populus. Populus is based on the idea of the plebiscite, which is also an Latin word. So it's very important to say that. Direct democracy is something that we really don't know what it is. because it's not enough to vote or in a referendum to be in direct democracy. Direct democracy within representative democracy is something weird, because referendum is parasitical on representation. That is, we go to a referendum when the prime minister cannot solve the problem, when the parliament is into a crisis. So the referendum is like a crutch, you said?
A crutch.
A crutch? Yes, a stampede, helping, but doesn't have the primary role. Second, the role of the media is crucial, of course. We cannot talk about that. But there is another element to be considered, is the jumping from the leader or the party leader and the people, jumping and bumping the intermediary bodies in between. So even parties are a problem in this case. One party perhaps is good, but many parties can be a problem, and also institutions inside. So the question of directness is not in the actions, but in the relationship between the leader and the people. That is crucial, in my view.
That's not new.
No, it's nothing new.
In Latin America.
I know.
That's not new. The kind of the reach out to the populace.
Fine, is new the
directly.
people. I'm sorry, but the people is old as the political tradition we know. So nothing new here, but it's the way in which they put together things. And finally, then I did. And another important thing is the crisis of parliamentary democracy. Europe shows how dangerous, problematic, and is the decline of parliamentary democracy as a form of democracy. Today, the critics is against parties. It is against the intermediation of parliaments for a quick direct relation between the people and the leader. This is an important issue. Finally, I don't want too much. The question of the relationship between the ethnos and demos, that is the nation and the people as a political actor. The ethnos as a cultural kind of entity in the name of which we, the nativists indeed, and the people or the demos as a political transcription. The two sometimes they coalesce in a conception of the people that is a kind of ontology of the true people as a true ethnos. You know, there is this combination of these two elements, political and non-political together, that would be important to analyze. Thank you.
Yes, please.
I don't know how much what I say will have to do with what other people said. In America, populism, except for a brief period in the 1950s when Richard Hofstadter, Columbia professor, and various historians were very uneasy about mass movements. It has traditionally been both on the left and the right, and Americans do not use the term the way Europeans do. It's very different. In Europe, even the left-wing populist movements like Podemos, the party, are very reluctant to be identified that way, even though theoretically they understand that their concept of the people as a substitute for the old historical socialist idea of the working class comes out of a populist tradition and owes something to the United States as well as Latin America. So, you know, when I talk about it, again, in American context, we are talking about something that has appeared on the left and the right, also something that's very embedded in our democratic tradition. You know, there are authoritarian strains on Republicans, right-wing, business conservatives, or whatever. For the most part, in America, we are talking about a democratic tradition of which populism is a part. Now, in terms of governing, and what was the contrast between opinion and actually governing? Yeah, well, right. One of the characteristics of populist movements is that they make demands that in the present context of politics can't be granted. Bernie Sanders, Medicare for all, and free public education. Now, these aren't inconceivable things. They're not crazy at all. I mean, in Europe or Canada, you have these things. But in the context of the United States and the Congress we have and the deadlock we have, they are crazy. It's not going to happen. Trump, again, he's going to put a 35% tariff on Ford trucks when they come back from Mexico. Now, we've never had selective tariffs. That's not going to happen. Even, you know, whether he becomes president or not. 45% tariff on Chinese goods until, you know, those are demands that in effect demarcate, establish a frontier, an absolute difference between the people and the elite. And the people, again, I'm talking about American populism. I think this is mostly European political scientists think this of an undifferentiated mass. That's not the idea. That's not the, I mean, when Bernie Sanders or Trump or any of these people, they don't have this same kind of concept. Rather, it's a way of bringing together heterogeneous parts of the population. And that was true of the original People's Party, was the Knights of Labor and the Farmers Alliance, two different groups. So it is in the United States, again, a form of coalition politics. And I think that's the way the left-wing Europeans see it now, too, in both in Greece and in Spain. So again, I'm a Wittgensteinian by by my academic background, and I commend to you the idea that there really isn't any kind of exclusive definition of populism that captures all these things. And Eastern European is very different from Western European. India and China, I don't even know anything about. I mean, so we really are talking about different things, and it's very important to differentiate, I think, the American variety from some of these other ones. And again, what I found in my book was that there are certain similarities between what happened in the United States and our tradition and Western Europe. But again, I wouldn't make the bridge over to Hungary and Poland and to Greece, the fascism in Greece, neo-Nazi movements. So.
But that brings you right in line with Federico. Everything is very complex, so go ahead, Federico.
Yes, I mean, and actually, although I believe it is always important to look at oneself, to realize what's going on with oneself, I think something that we have to ironically thank populism is that basically the phenomenon of populism has been in history for a while. It appears everywhere, and in fact, Trump looks much more like Duterte than previous examples like, in American democracy. So my point is this is one of the lessons I think as scholars for us is that what can we learn about the center by focusing on what's going on in the margins? Because in fact, as an Argentine, I'm surprised about how much Trumpism is related to Peronism or other strains of and then you go to Germany, and Pegida is all the time talking about, the lying press, which is exactly what, Maduro is saying in Venezuela and Trump is saying here. Now, of course, there are important differences. One of them is the notion of the people itself. Because, when you study populism and you see what's going on, whether this is, although the spectrum is problematic, right, left, but, what happens with populism is that historically, and this is another thing that some of my colleagues in, in other disciplines do not get well, which is, for example, a colleague has been stressing that populism is always about excluding others, and it's always against democratic participation. That sounds very cute, but doesn't explain why populism is successful. In fact, historically, the moment is that basically it includes many while excluding minorities. And what is important is when you analyze populist regimes, one important thing to go back and see in them is that are they excluding people in terms of their ethnic backgrounds, religion, or perhaps having different ideas? Because, for example, in Latin America, what you have, and for a time, by the way, it has been the tradition in the US, and now in Trump, we see something different that looks, I agree, very much like Europe now, and also very much like Argentinian neo-fascists in the 1970s. So what you see is that, for example, in Latin America, the tradition has been both left and right, that the problem and the issue of excluding others is those that do not agree with what the leader says. The leader makes an interpretation of what the people want, and in a way it's kind of authoritarian but also inclusive. You are welcome into the people as much as you agree with me. Now, with Trump, you have something different, because sometimes, even if you agree with me, you are not a true American. You are against what will make America great again. So here you have this new frontier, which is the ethnic boundary, and which defines basically what is a populism of the right vis-a-vis a populism of the left. Because, I mean, it's very inclusive, but hard. I mean, even, you know, in classic Peronism, and Peron was, before he became the elected president, he was quite into fascism. He even visited Italy, you know, he really liked it and so on, but he was a very smart politician. So, I mean, even the Jews, such as, you know, my grandparents, I mean, they could be members of the Peronist Jewish Association. I mean, you could even be, you know, enjoying your ethnic particularity, but you don't have to be a Jewish Peronist. You cannot be a Jewish other. So this is a central issue. The last thing I would like to say, I mean, which is very important, is what's new? I mean, and this is the question that we historians ask ourselves all the time. What is new is a different context. And the fact of the economic crisis, for example. I mean, economic crisis, as you know, was very important in the emergence of another thing, another ism, which is fascism. And I think it is also very important in the new populisms. But it was not that important in the 1940s and 50s. For example, actually, the moment there was that there was a good economic situation and was a crisis of political participation. So these people were saying, we are earning a lot of money, why we cannot vote? Which is similar to the situation in China, perhaps. So basically, the point is like, what changes is the context. And certainly we have a context of economic crisis and crisis of liberalism now, which explains why this resembles also populism and fascism at the same time.
Yeah. So a couple points. One is what's new, and the other is about whether populism is such a you know a jumble concept. We cannot sort of there's too many different varieties. On what's new, I think one thing we drew, Carol, I think you summarized it really well, is that we do see that social media is something new. You know, traditionally, populist leaders have used media to reach out in Latin America to the, you know, populists and to have this sort of more direct contact with people. But now, but that's more domestic. There's, you know, within the nation state. Now, social media, the nature of social media is a globalization, in fact. It does have sort of a borderless information flow. You know, we talk about the personnel flow, but also information. And it's not a stretch. Sometimes I get my information about what's happening in the United States on Chinese social media. How fast it is. So, you know, they'll travel very fast. So that makes this global, if you will. I think that's the second point is about whether this, you know, really, John highlights the differences among different kind of countries and different continents. But I do see there are some similarities, maybe in part because of the globalization, ironically, you know, as a result. Talk about GMO debates, talk about climate change debate. You know, all this scientific, you know, this progressivism, and you know, more conservatism. That debate is happening everywhere. Same thing in China, except that maybe it's different issues.
Well, I heard many of you say that one of the common enemies is liberalism, and liberalism is defined differently in each of these societies. That's another problem we have. If you think populism has many faces, liberalism does. So, but there is something, the political correctness, for example, of the, so, you know, I don't think that the commonality of people arguing about climate change all over the world or arguing about GMOs all over the world is actually new, because you could find the content of something people argued about being the same. The question is the form different and the outcome different? Because in every period there are kind of common themes that grab the people, even when they had very slow-moving ships, you know, and without fast-moving chips. So I think more it's a question of the things you're talking about. That what do those debates signify? What's going on underneath those debates that make those debates what they are, make them so heated? There's where the commonalities lie. Well, now we're going to let you figure it all out. So I'd like to open the floor to questions and comments. But if it's a comment, let's keep it short so everybody can talk. So you're welcome to speak to any point. Who's got the microphone now? Please, go ahead. I can't see you, but.
Thank you, and thanks to all the panelists.
Will you speak right into the microphone?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Perfect.
It was Professor Finchelstein, I believe, who said it's always against liberalism. And I found that to be a very intriguing statement. I would like the professor to say whether he means Adam Smithian liberalism in the sense of free movement of capital and labor, and whether he would like to embellish that thought that such liberalism tends to dissolve the borders, the differences among individuals.
To go and see back in the sources, what do they understand by liberalism? And this is sometimes very general, but generally, in many places and countries, what you see is that a common understanding of liberalism as separation of powers, tolerance, plurality, and the kind of things that you might associate with modern democracies. I mean, for example, Perón in the 1940s, he was emphasizing the fact that he was even more democratic than the US. By the way, he, as the fascists before him, will refer constantly to the issue of civil rights in the US as a problem in that democracy. But in any case, which is interesting because this is a criticism of liberalism from the right and people that actually do not like liberalism. And Perón will denounce and will talk about demoliberalismo or demoliberalism, associating a form of democracy with liberalism. Now, so basically what you see is that there is an association in many populists, particularly in the 1940s and 50s, but this continues with a particular type of understanding of democracy, and they present another one. But the issue here is, the issue of plurality, I think, because whether you understand the people as many citizens participating in the political process, the political system, or whether you understand democracy as the way in which a majority of the people are suddenly defined as the people as a whole, and because of a particular moment in a particular election, they are legitimized in excluding others from the people and even from the politics of the country. Now, in fascism, they are totally excluded. So basically, these enemies are turned into public enemies, and eventually they might even be persecuted and eliminated. Now, in populism, that is not needed. They need minorities to confirm that they are minorities, to be relegated to a particular situation and keep voting and keep losing. Now, in general, in populism, and this is the last thing I would like to say, what you find is that, unlike fascism, in most populisms, what you have is that eventually they accept the democratic game, and when they lose elections, they go. My own country has seen this many, many times.
So the answer, I guess, to your question is it's not Adam Smith that's the problem. That's what he just said. Does anybody think that it's the economic? Yeah, exactly. But there's another view which says, one view is that's the political view, I think, of liberalism, the plurality, the political correctness, all of the tolerance. But what about, because we hear a lot about trade, we hear a lot about economic borderlessness and the threats, and what about that? It can't be an accident that so many of these populists are against this, are against free trade and stuff. So anybody on the economic question? The question is, the question that is, you want to ask it again?
I'll rephrase it. I was thinking of Smithian liberalism as...
Oh, here's a question.
Yes. So that's the question.
In a purely Smithian world, you would have no national boundaries. You would have pure laissez-faire capitalism. A person would rise or fall solely on his or her merit in the marketplace. There's no place for religion. There's no place for a nation. There's no place for social classes. All the things that make individuals distinctive are gone.
You want to take that? It's the question. It's the economic question.
Look, again, with liberalism, as you say, there's Australian liberals and American liberals are completely different, and we're not. In the United States, liberalism is in the 20th century is a form of progressivism. It's adopted from the British liberals. FDR was very influenced by Lloyd George and people like that. Populist movements are different from liberal movements now, I would say, in one very important respect. We're talking about America now, which is that liberalism has the idea of pluralism and the accommodation of different interests, including business. With Theodore Roosevelt, when he was formulating it, I talked about, we can't be for capital and we can't be for labor. We have to find some way to transcend those interests and find a way to, at the same time, to accommodate them. So that's the essential idea of liberalism in America. Populists, both Sanders and Trump, are not from that school. Sanders talked of himself as a progressive, but he differentiates his politics from the billionaire class. Occupy Wall Street, not a liberal movement in that sense. Hillary Clinton, more liberal. Again, I think that this was part of the underlying debate between Clinton and Sanders. It's more of a, the liberal question is more important for looking at the left and Democrats in America than it is looking at somebody like Trump. The only thing I'd say about it is that what's peculiar again about Trump and George Wallace, if you look at their politics, is that they don't repudiate the achievements of New Deal liberalism. George Wallace was very much a New Deal liberal on Social Security, Medicare. He wanted to tax the rich more. One of the distinguishing things about Trump is that he's not for cutting entitlements, this word that Pete Peterson and people have invented in order to attack Social Security and Medicare. He's for protecting them. So again, it's a kind of, it's a mixed up situation.
That could be the epigraph or the epitaph. Yeah, it's a mixed up situation. Well, the answer to your question, obviously, in this panel is they're not buying that as the reason. You're hearing another political example. Okay, next question.
We are at time, so I don't know how many more questions you would like to
We have another
take.
15 minutes, right?
Actually, it's 8 o'clock, so we are a little
I thought
over
it was
time.
8:30. Ah,
So-
it's my mistake. Let's take up more questions. I thought it was 8:30.
Okay.
Let's take up more questions.
Yes, we have one here.
My question is to Professor Urbinati and the other professor who endorsed Urbinati's claim that populism is a disfigurement of democracy.
Yeah, I endorsed it, yes.
Yes. No, but my question is, I don't know, I'm thinking of Laclos' The Populist Reason, where he claims that populism is so to speak, the essence of the political, right? And this we versus them opposition, right, that is inherent in populism. I don't know, and Chantal Mouffe also in a recent interview, she said, look, what is interesting in the rise of this right-wing populism in Europe is that they bring to the fore the fact that the enemy and friend distinction is crucial to politics, right? And so my question is, when you dismiss populism as degradation of democracy, don't you risk dismissing also the political as a source of we versus the other opposition?
Yes, briefly. I'm sorry, I mistook the time, so briefly, yeah.
Should I?
Yes,
Otherwise
go ahead.
So we can talk about that. We already started, actually. So I understand their argument, of course, but of course, if you say that populism is the best definition of politics and thus of democracy, we have nothing to say, because they combine together three things: democracy, politics, and populism. So it is as if that in the dark night, everything is black. Of course it's black, but then you turn on the light and you see the differences. So the difference between populism and politics, there are friends, enemies. It's not an invention of Carl Schmitt. If you go back to Machiavelli, friends, enemies is already there. But would you say that everything looks like a friend, enemies in the way in which Schmitt presents it? I would say no. Second, populism is part of the democratic tradition. Of course, it develops all the time from inside. It's like a karstic river. It goes down for a while and then comes back within democratic society because it lives out of contestation, participations, and operation of equality against the elite and so on and so forth. But you wouldn't say that populism is the same thing as democracy, because otherwise we have nothing to say in the end. So the distinction is important because it's a way to understand each of them. So I tend thus to disagree with the methodology of combining all, because they don't help us to understand none of them.
Well, I do hear, though, in most of your comments that populism and democracy are very closely linked, so that maybe in the dark night everything is dark, but there's a link there. I'm sorry that because of my mistaking the time, we've gone over, so I think I should call this to an end because of your schedules. I want to thank you, and I want to thank the panelists for a very good session.